Hello and welcome back, and that is right, we're continuing our talk about the UGREEN NAS series of devices coming to Kickstarter, and today it's the turn of the beefiest unit of all, the DXP8800 Plus, rocking out the gate at crowdfunding currently at $974 with an RRP of $1,499. This is the biggest and the most expensive NAS in that whole lineup. It's also the one that, for those of you that take storage the most seriously, and particularly you photo and video editors, you content creators and more, this is the one that you've had your eyes on. But I would argue amongst all of the systems out there, this is the biggest one that I would probably use the word gamble, because it's the most money. Whether it is you're looking at that RRP price or you were one of the early backers that got that crazy 40% off luck, this is an expensive system, rocking out with an i5 Intel 10 core processor inside, 12th generation, with integrated graphics and 8 gig of DDR5 memory that can be scaled up pretty substantially, I believe up to 64 gig. This is a scalable system that also arrives with 8 bays of SATA storage there and a couple of M2 NVMe's of Gen 4 SSD storage. It's also one of the systems, and there isn't many of them, that arrives with a PCIe upgrade slot. I've gone ahead and installed a 2-port 10G card, more on that later on, but this is a tremendously scalable system indeed. Now, if you've watched my other videos on the 4-bay UGREEN NAS and the little flash NAS, I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of bits because I did cover a lot of ground in that, and I think there are some of you out there that would have watched those videos. But when you get this, you get the accessory kit. Again, it arrives with the gold-plated RJ45 couple of cables. It's an internal PSU inside there. Also with the system, it arrives with a paper manual there. It arrives with keys and locks for inside. It also arrives with pretty substantial thermal pads for the SSDs that go inside. We'll be going in a little bit deeper later on that. And ultimately, it's a very well put together device, very well presented, just like the other UGREEN device we talked about, but we are still talking about a device going through crowdfunding from a brand who one might argue is a bit big to be going down the indie crowdfunding route there. But nonetheless, we've covered that in other videos. I'd recommend you check them out. Currently, the software it's arriving with, the UGOS UGREEN NAS operating system, still in beta, has seen several revisions there, and it is having features added to it. It's got, Docker Manager put inside it there. It's had optimization in a number of key areas, but it is still in beta. Luckily, something that has changed since our early coverage of this series is that these devices now can be utilized with third-party NAS operating systems without it invalidating your warranty, with the system arriving with 3 years of hardware warranty included, which is great to see. Now, in terms of design, I'm going to say right now, I really like the design of this device. I've always been a fan of all of the scaling of it. They've really gone for their own individual look there. It is a tank. It is metal all the way around. I like the fact that the rear of the system has got that magnetic filter panel and the 2 rear-mounted fans there when the system is in operation. I like the fact that the front of the system arrives with Thunderbolt 4 connectivity there, 2 ports for you to take advantage of, as well as an SD card slot. Seriously, why is that not more common? And on top of that, a 10 gig USB connection there on the front, and the drives are click and load. You can go ahead, if you choose, and install 2.5-inch media inside these if you wish, or you can go ahead and install 3.5-inch media inside these if you wish. And these are click and load trays, which you can again install drives inside without a screwdriver. You do need a screwdriver for the 2.5-inch media, but it's got the locking mechanism, goes inside, you're ready to go. But I will say I'm not a big fan of these trays. I've mentioned that before, but in the back end of this, there are combined SATA and data SATA power and SATA data connectors there on the rear. It does not support SAS drives. There isn't a SAS version of this. At the moment, we've got this system fully populated with 4 Toshiba MG NAS drives alongside 4 Kingston, I believe DC600M data center class SATA drives inside there, and we've also got 2 KC3000 Kingston Gen 4 M2 NVMe's in the base panel of this system. Here at the bottom, we've got ourselves a lovely little section that allows us to not only install a couple of M2 NVMe's for caching or raw storage pools if we wish, but we've also got the ability to upgrade the memory if we like, and ultimately, I'm quite happy. Now, a number of you are going to be wondering, when we look at the bottom of this system, why have I not upgraded that memory for this video? You're going to see the performance numbers later on in this video, and there's going to be those of you that are going to say immediately, you're going to get high performance numbers if you upgrade that memory. And you're right, but this is a system rocking out with 8 gig, and that is what I'm going to test it with. I like that it's got DDR5, it's Samsung memory as well, so it's not even cheap unbranded memory, and there's 2 slots for us to play with to scale that up. Also, the 2 NVMe's inside there, I've removed the thermal pads on the top, but the thermal pads that they arrived with were very good, and the temperature of the drives when in operation was pretty darn good as well. This system does not arrive with any kind of Wi-Fi connectivity like the little flash model. You are heavily dependent on just utilizing the network ports. But what about those network ports? The system has 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports there on the rear. It's got a bit more USB, and as mentioned, a PCIe upgrade slot. You can go ahead and slam in pretty much anything. That is a standard X540T2 Intel upgrade card there, what I picked up on AliExpress for like 45 quid. This gives you a huge amount of network scalability alongside those 2 existing 10G ports, not 2.5 and 10, 2 times 10 GBE, a potential 2 gigabytes per second external network connectivity on there, depending on if you're going to take advantage of link aggregation, SMB multi-channel, and more. Now, in the software, a lot of these features and functionality for network controls, they're there, but they're not fully there. There is support of SMB multi-channel, but there isn't support, for example, of changing the MTU and the jumbo packet currently, something I'll talk about later on when we did our performance testing on this. The HDMI output on this system, I would argue, is a little bit underwhelming. You can output it to an 8K monitor if you choose. You will need more memory to use 8K, but at least 4K at the very least. But you will still need to use the mobile application to push it. There isn't a dedicated GUI for the HDMI output. So it's a little bit clunky in order to really take advantage of that. You can at least connect it and then use your mobile to kind of cast over HDMI, so to speak. But the network connectivity on this I find very, very appealing there. And although the Thunderbolt ports there sound great, I do think it's worth touching on that those Thunderbolt ports can only be used with the system as the host. They can only be really used for storage at this time, although UGREEN have told me that they are trying to work on utilizing those as a network bridge. But again, only QNAP I've ever known has ever really successfully done that. A few brands have tried, like Promise, but nothing's really come of it. So if they're successful in that, good for them. But one understands that there is a lot of Mickey Mouse you have to do with the likes of Intel and the Thunderbolt community to get that sort of thing done. Now, moving away from the design of it, because, you know, I like the design even if it is a bit beefy, let's talk a little bit about this system's performance. Let's talk about what it can do and when we have the system in operation. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, I have done a deep dive on the UGOS NAS software, as you can see here sped up on screen. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video, but I will direct you in the comments towards the full detailed breakdown of that. It's around 2 revisions older. The software is still very much in beta, and it has been optimized, and they have added a few extra bells and whistles, but currently at the time of recording it's really only Docker that's been added to it that's any significant improvement there. Still, nonetheless, it's still pretty darn good. We also tested the same hardware architecture across different UGREEN NAS devices in Plex Media Server thanks to the support of containers, and it was able to perform sterlingly well for Plex Media Server all the way up to 8K as well, but of course that is going to be heavily client specific. There is the standard file management there for you there, lots of multi-user access, being able to initiate shares over SMB and full control over different file protocols there. Also, the system does arrive with a number of different protective measures built in, from auto block and what to do when you've got unknown IPs coming into the system, and there is the ability to pop on the old encrypted certificate if you choose. But do keep in mind that currently in the beta there is still no 2-factor authentication, and the security manager tool on there I do find a little bit lackluster, and I do hope UGREEN are really going to hit that a little bit harder. Also mentioned earlier on, when it comes to network protocol management, there isn't any ability to adapt the MTU or jumbo frames at the moment, which definitely impacts a lot of the performance numbers later on in this video. On top of that, there is no iSCSI support currently. There's no ability to create a target and a LAN on there, which means we were kind of limited to SMB multi-channel for a lot of our performance later on. Nonetheless, with wide support of different hard drives and SSDs and the compatibility listings, and we were able to create 3 different RAID groups inside this system with 4 of those Toshiba NAS drives in a RAID 5, those 4 Kingston DC600 SSDs in a RAID 0, and in a single setup there, the Kingston SK3000 there. Now, when it came to power use, I had the 4 Toshiba 8TB NAS drives in a RAID 5. I had those 4 Kingston DC600 data center SSDs in a RAID 0, and that Kingston SK3000 Gen 4 NVMe in a just single there, so no RAID combined. In idle, I had the system clocking at 63 to 65 watts, and that was with the system untouched for 20 minutes, allowing the system to kind of spin down to a ready to go but not active use state. Whereas you can see on screen, in active use, I was hitting somewhere between 88 and 92 watts, and that was with performance test happening on the NVMe's. That was with the 4 SSDs in a RAID 0 having active write, and the 8TB RAID 5 4-disk configuration there running sector scans there. So again, we've got decent numbers. Probably a little high, I think, for a system of this scale, but this is an 8-bay industrial system. So not terrible, but slightly higher than some of you might like. Next up, I did a 10 GBE Windows transfer. I focused on the RAID 5 there because I think when it comes to archival storage, that's really what people are going to be looking for here. And until we've got iSCSI LUNs and targets, I'm not really going to pursue too heavily onto those NVMe's for content creators. And I know a number of you got software that is dependent on iSCSI and tricking your local system into thinking it's a logical drive. I transferred 10.5 gigabytes of data over the 10 GBE connection, and it took 54 seconds, averaging 280 to 310 megs per second, although mathematically probably closer to 210, 220 megs. Then continuing with some of the more bog standard stuff, I went ahead and connected an external Thunderbolt and USB Type 4 combined SSD and transferred 50 gig of data over to it on the internal operating system. It took 2 minutes and 30 seconds. It averaged out at 241 to 247 megabytes per second, depending on your calculation, which again isn't out of this world, but still not too shabby for the kind of dense media I was moving over. 4K and 8K huge files there, some of them 1 to 1.5 gig for a single file. I was quite happy with that. Next, spreading that performance just a little bit wider there, I dipped into AJA for some 5K heavy dense performance, testing 3 different file types at 512 megabytes, 1 gigabyte and 4 gigabytes in size. I was running it onto a shared SMB drive connected via a 10 GBE external card, and that was with the RAID 5 hard drives, the 2.5 inch SSDs and the single NVMe. And I was kind of at the beginning with the smaller file size hitting the same number there at 630 over 630 for the hard drives, and both kinds of SSDs hitting 690 over 640. With the 1 gig file there, we saw 450 over 640 for the hard drives, and again both types of SSD hitting 690 over 645. And again, this was largely the case with diminishing returns on the 4 gigabyte file, which with the hard drives went down to 378 over 405, but both of the SSDs capping there at 670 to 680 over 630 megabytes per second. That was an unusual bottleneck I was seeing there throughout my testing. Now again, I couldn't adapt the MTU on the side of the network adapter on the system, and I tested this with the external 10G ports, by the way, on that PCIe card, which did appear on the network manager there on the UGOS software there, so I'm not quite sure what was going on there. So from here I decided to move over to SSH and kind of investigate some of those PCIe lanes just a little bit. Before I went into any great detail, I just decided to run some cursory performance numbers in SSH using PuTTY on the NVMe's. On the first NVMe in slot 1 on that Gen 4x4 slot, I was able to achieve 4.3 gigabytes over 3.2 gigabytes read-write, and that's on the first drive with a 1 gig file transfer. Again, transferring data between them, however, I was hitting performance numbers of just 1.1 to 1.2 gigabytes per second, which was much less than I expected. When I did HD Palm, I got an average of 3 gigabytes per second on the first SSD, but at the second SSD, I was hitting 1.1, 1.2 and peaking at 1.6 gigabytes per second, which seemed really odd to me, given both of these M2 NVMe's are Gen 4x4 slots. So I dug into the PCIe layer of this system, and indeed, the first M2 NVMe slot is Gen 4x4, and hell, the operating system drive, that is a Gen 3x1 slot, but that's still 1000 megs for the operating system SSD, that's fine. But the second slot, although it is Gen 4x4, has been downgraded to Gen 3x2, or 8 gigatransfers times 2 speed there. That would only give me 2000 megabytes per second to play with, and that would explain, at least in my eyes, why I was getting throttled there when transferring the data, or why my performance numbers were not hitting that full 3 to 4 gigabytes per second of the other drives. But nonetheless, when we dipped into the operating system UGOS and looked at the performance numbers of using the self-testing, we could see that that first drive was still able to hit 5 to 5.5 gigabytes per second in the operating system there. Nonetheless, I'm sure if I played around with the blocks, go down to 128K or something, I could probably eke some higher numbers out of this. But nonetheless, the real takeaway here was that downgrading of that second slot. Now, I don't believe that's being caused by my use of that Kingston SSD, because I'm using the same SSD in both of those slots. But nonetheless, it was food for thought. And lastly, I want to talk about the noise of this system when in operation, because it won't come as a big surprise to a number of you that an 8-bay system that's using a decent amount of metal all the way around its chassis is gonna make a decent amount of noise. The microphone is just shy of 2 feet away from this system. I'm going to go ahead and boot this device to give you some idea about the maximum volume you may expect from this system when in operation. So, not so bad, right? I kind of expect it to make a lot more noise than this. A lot of the time when I had this set up, I had it going on in the background of other videos. And that beep, by the way, corresponds to the system has now finished booting. Remember, this has got 4 enterprise grade 8TB drives. It's got 4 SSDs, fine, but it's got full population right now. The fans are working. They're just not spun up to the highest. Now, if I make my way into the system, I'm going to go ahead and action full fan noise on this system. Fan activated. And that's the noise of the system when the fans are in full. I'll even bring the mic tremendously close to give you some idea what it would sound like from a distance of about 25 centimeters. Let's be realistic. If you came to this video, chances are you're doing it because you're wondering whether this thing is worth the risk on crowdfunding. Right now, UGREEN do not have the pedigree in the world of NAS that a number of other brands that we talked about here on the channel have. But there's no avoiding that at its price tag, it is very, very appealing. To put it into perspective, you've got things like the Synology DS1821, which rocks out the gate at approximately 1,000 Nika. And with that system, with its rather modest AMD embedded Ryzen processor, that system with 4 gig of ECC memory, with 1 gig Ethernet out the gate, M2 NVMe's locked in behind non-use of storage pools without using their drives, and, you know, slightly arguably aggressive tactics towards hard drives. There's a lot of reason why users are looking at third parties like these guys for network attached storage systems moving forward as the years go on. But do keep in mind that when you are buying this, I can't fault the hardware for the most part. I'm still a bit unsure about this business of the lanes there and the downgraded speed on that second M2 NVMe slot that I'll be talking about with UGREEN after this video. But I will say, in terms of hardware, this is incredibly good value at that price point. But that's the point. It's about the hardware, because the minute you move over to the software, keep in mind that UGREEN NAS Software is not going to compete, at least not at the moment, or probably not even at launch, with your Synology DSMs, your QNAP QTSs, hell, your Acer Stores ADMs and your TerraMaster TOSs, but I'll have to wait and see. But the fact that they've softened their position on third-party and NAS operating systems is an enormous plus for me. That was always, and I mentioned it in first videos and I said it here, that was my big sticking point for users looking at this as a potential NAS storage solution, that they couldn't move away from that software. Sure, you can use it, hell, you might even like it and it might get better, but now you're not locked into it. That makes this thing even more appealing to me on the software level, when previously it was all about the hardware. Ultimately, I do think these guys are going to get this over the finish line for crowdfunding. I don't think we're looking at a Storaxa. I don't think we're looking at a hype raid. Look that up if you don't know what it is. It's a horror story. But this is a system I think is going to see retail, and although it is not perfect, I'd say for an 8-bay power desktop user device at this price point, it is near enough unbeatable. Is it the ultimate 8-bay? No. Is it the ultimate 8-bay for hardware? Probably. It's just I wish that software just came forward a bit more, and we will be keeping an eye on it. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Again, there are links in the description to get hold of this device over on Kickstarter. Again, the links are there. Use them. It really helps out the channel. But apart from that, I would say right now, if you are already backing this, I would say stick with it, because I think this is going to cross the finish line, and I am really pleased with what I've seen here. If you aren't backing it yet and you were already looking at Synology and QNAP and TerraMaster and Acer Store or going TrueNAS, why were you looking at them in the first place? And if that reason was software, then maybe stick with your original plan. But if it was the hardware, you're going to be hard beaten to push. You're going to be hard pushed to beat this. Thank you so much for watching. There's a link in the description to the full review. We'll hopefully be looking at the 6-bay very soon as well. Should Synology and QNAP be worried about this? Let's talk about it in the comments below. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.